For a long time, the records do not say that the Anunnaki disappeared. They do not describe a war in the heavens, no rebellion, no final judgment, no collapse of divine power. Instead, the silence arrives without ceremony. The gods do not fall. They simply stop acting, and the scribes notice, quietly, carefully, and continue writing anyway. Temples remain active. Rituals proceed on schedule. Kings still rule. Laws are still enforced. But somewhere between the earliest Sumerian tablets and the later chronicles of Babylon, divine authority shifts from presence to memory. No text explains why. No tablet records a decision. There is no farewell written into clay. There is only absence and an administrative system that adapts to it without comment. Before we go any further, pause for a moment and consider how unsettling that is. Civilizations usually record collapse in detail. They describe invasion, disasters, revolutions, famines. Yet here, in the most meticulous record-keeping culture of the ancient world, something fundamental changes, and no one explains it. If you are drawn to histories that focus not on what is proclaimed, but on what quietly disappears, then you are exactly where you should be. Because tonight, we are not reading ancient texts for what they proudly declare. We are reading them for what they slowly stop saying. What follows is not mythology in the modern sense. It is not a story about gods throwing thunderbolts or shaping humanity from cosmic chaos. This is about bureaucracy, about inventories, about accounting systems so precise that they tracked individual sheep, measured fields down to their boundaries, and recorded the movement of authority with the same care used to count grain. And inside those records, pressed into wet clay nearly 5,000 years ago, divine names appear not as poetic symbols, but as institutional facts. The earliest written documents in human history come from the city of Uruk around 3,300 BCE. These tablets are small, rough, uneven, and unimpressive at first glance. Many are no larger than a modern smartphone. They were formed from river clay, pressed flat by hand, and marked with reed styluses while still soft. There are no epics here, no prayers, no heroic narratives. What these tablets record are rations, deliveries, land allocations, labor assignments, barley, beer, livestock, fields, names. And among those names are beings we later call gods. Enlil, Enki, Anu, written with the same bureaucratic neutrality as any human official. This is what makes the earliest references to the Anunnaki so strange. They arrive in the written record fully established. There is no introduction, no explanation of who they are or where they came from. They are simply present, already embedded in the administrative machinery of the world's first cities. A field is listed as belonging to Enlil. Sheep are recorded as the property of Enki. Offerings are allocated not symbolically, but as measurable assets. These are not metaphors. These are accounting categories. And perhaps most unsettling of all, there is no developmental phase. The Anunnaki do not evolve over time within the texts. They do not become more powerful, more complex, or more abstract. They appear complete from the very beginning. Names, hierarchies, domains, and authority are already fixed. It is as if the scribes were not inventing theology, but documenting something already known long before writing existed. Something preserved orally, then finally locked into permanence once clay tablets made memory verifiable. This matters because these records do not behave like myths. Myths exaggerate. They dramatize. They collapse complexity into narrative. These tablets do the opposite. They flatten divine authority into procedure. They reduce God's owners, administrators, guarantors. Why would a civilization bother tracking divine property with such precision if those beings were purely symbolic? Why apply audit-level accountability to entities that existed only in ritual imagination? The temple complexes of early Mesopotamia functioned as economic engines. They owned land, employed laborers, managed production, and redistributed resources. To operate at that scale, they required rigid systems of record-keeping. And those systems consistently distinguished between human property, institutional property, and divine property. Not conceptually, but legally. Administrators could be held responsible for mismanaging land owned by a god, just as they could be held responsible for mismanaging land owned by a human authority. The distinction mattered enough to preserve it across generations. And here's where the silence begins to form its outline. As centuries pass, the tablets continue. The records grow more sophisticated. Writing becomes standardized. Cities expand. Empires rise. But the role of the god within these documents begins to shift. Subtly at first, then unmistakably. Divine names move from active entries to inherited references. Authority once documented as operational becomes something assumed, then something remembered. The system continues to function, but the gods no longer appear as participants. This is not a collapse. It is a handover. And the most disturbing part is that the scribes never tell us why. The transition becomes clearer when we stop looking for drama and start paying attention to structure. Ancient Mesopotamian civilization did not collapse when divine presence faded. In fact, it stabilized. That alone should give us pause. Civilizations usually fracture when their foundational beliefs fail. But here, the opposite happens. As the gods retreat from daily administration, the human systems they once governed become more consistent, more codified, more independent. Authority does not vanish. It reorganizes. Nowhere is this clearer than in the earliest royal records. The Sumerian king list is often dismissed as mythology because of its impossible numbers, but that dismissal ignores its format. This is not poetry. It is not epic narrative. It is a ledger, a chronological register, city by city, king by king, reign length by reign length. The tone is administrative, almost clinical, and it opens with a phrase that quietly reframes everything that follows. After kingship descended from heaven, not invented, not negotiated, not earned, descended. Before that moment, according to record, there was no kingship at all, no centralized authority, and what they preserved was not explanation, but transition, a clear before and after, an era of impossible time, followed by an era that slowly becomes human. Archaeology reinforces the strangeness of this transition. Southern Mesopotamia does not evolve slowly into civilization. It accelerates. Within a remarkably short span, scattered farming villages give way to large urban centers. Monumental architecture appears. Writing emerges not as crude marks, but as a system capable of abstraction from its earliest phase. Irrigation networks are constructed that require centralized planning and mathematical precision far beyond what small village societies typically produce. The leap is not incremental. It is systemic, and embedded within this leap, from the very beginning, are divine authorities already functioning as institutional realities. The Anunnaki are not introduced. They are assumed. The scribes do not explain their authority because explanation is unnecessary. Everyone already knows, or at least, everyone is expected to behave as if they do. But systems built on assumed authority only remain stable as long as that authority remains unquestioned. And over time, something subtle happens. The gods remain named, but their actions recede. Ownership remains attributed, but oversight fades. Authority becomes symbolic rather than operational. The machine keeps running, but the operators disappear from view. This pattern appears again and again in law, in economics, in kingship. Early legal codes describe gods as active guarantors of justice. They command, they judge, they enforce. Later codes still invoke the same gods, but only in the opening lines, as distant sources of legitimacy. Once the system is established, the gods vanish from the text. Humans judge, humans punish, humans enforce. Divine authority authorizes once, then steps back. This is not secularism in the modern sense. Ritual remains intense. Temples thrive. Festivals continue. Offerings are made daily. But the gods no longer manage outcomes. They no longer intervene when systems fail. They are present everywhere in name, but nowhere in action. The flood traditions preserve this shift with uncomfortable clarity. In these texts, the gods do not destroy humanity out of moral outrage. They do it because of administrative failure. Too many people, too much noise, too much disruption. The decision is debated, it is contested, and after catastrophe, The gods do not tighten control. They do the opposite. They impose limits on lifespan, fertility, population, and withdrawal. They redesign the system so it no longer requires constant divine management. This is the moment where divine governance transforms into structural control. Parameters replace supervision. Rules replace presence. And once those rules are set, the gods step back. The world is allowed to run on its own. By the time we reach later Mesopotamian periods, this withdrawal is complete. Gods are still honored, still feared, still invoked, but never expected to act. Divination becomes technical. Omens are cataloged. Astrology becomes calculation. Meaning is extracted from systems, not received from voices. The universe becomes readable, predictable, because it operates according to fixed principles. And here's the question that refuses to go away. Why does a civilization record the fading of divine action without recording the reason? If this were purely mythological evolution, we would expect explanation, reinterpretation, rationalization. But instead, we get silence, administrative silence. The most disciplined record keepers in human history simply move on, as if whatever happened was either too obvious to explain or too dangerous to record. The Anunnaki do not vanish in fire or war. They do not leave behind warnings or prophecies. They become ancestors, names, foundations, memory. The system they establish continues to function with remarkable stability for thousands of years, long after their presence disappears from the operational record. And that leaves us with a final, deeply unsettling thought as we move forward. If authority can withdraw without collapse, if systems can function without their founders, then absence itself may not be failure. It may be the final stage of control. The idea that absence can be a form of control feels uncomfortable because it contradicts how power usually presents itself. We expect authority to announce itself, to enforce, to intervene when challenged. Yet, the Mesopotamian record suggests something very different. It suggests that the most durable systems are not those ruled by constant oversight, but those engineered so thoroughly that oversight becomes unnecessary. And once that threshold is crossed, presence becomes inefficient. Intervention becomes a liability. This is why the withdrawal of divine authority does not coincide with chaos. There is no period of confusion where humans scramble to replace the gods. There is no sudden collapse of legitimacy. Kings do not question their mandate. Judges do not hesitate to issue rulings. Temples do not suspend rituals while waiting for new instructions. Everything continues, as if the system had already been trained to operate without supervision. Nowhere is this more revealing than in how kingship itself evolves. Early texts treat kings as intermediaries, not rulers in their own right. They are stewards, executing divine will that remains active and present. Later texts still describe kings as chosen by the gods, but the choice becomes historical rather than ongoing. The gods chose. Past tense. The king now rules by inheritance, by lineage, by precedent. Divine approval becomes something assumed, not confirmed. This shift is subtle but devastating in its implications. Once authority is inherited rather than renewed, legitimacy no longer depends on divine action. It depends on continuity, on memory, on documentation, on archives that preserve the fiction of uninterrupted mandate. The gods do not need to appear because their approval has already been recorded, and records, unlike beings, do not argue or change their minds. The legal systems reinforce this transition with remarkable consistency. Early law codes speak as if justice itself is an active extension of divine will. Later codes speak as if justice, it means that after a certain point, even proximity to the gods no longer grants exemption from the system. The system has become supreme. And once that happens, the gods themselves become subject to the rules they established. Intervention becomes not just unnecessary, but prohibited. At the top of this hierarchy sits Anu, the supreme authority, and yet he is almost entirely absent. His silence is not neglect. It is structural. He represents the final stage of delegated power, sovereignty without visibility, presence without action, authority that exists only through the systems it set in motion. Anu does not speak because speaking would imply management. He does not intervene because intervention would imply instability. His absence signals that the system no longer requires correction. Or worse, that correction is no longer possible. As time moves forward, this model spreads. Gods who once walked among humans retreat into ritual. Divine speech becomes omen. Omen becomes calculation. Calculation becomes law. Law becomes routine. What was once sacred becomes procedural, not because it is disbelieved, but because belief is no longer operationally relevant. The Neo-Assyrian world demonstrates this outcome clearly. Empires rise. Armies march. Cities burn. Kings boast of conquest and credit the gods, but the gods never instruct them. Victories are interpreted as divine favor only after they occur. Defeat is explained as divine displeasure only in retrospect. The gods no longer guide events. They are used to explain them. This is a crucial reversal. Authority once directed outcomes. Now outcomes define authority. Ritual continues with obsessive precision, but no one expects response. Offerings are made not to provoke action, but to maintain alignment, to keep the system balanced. The gods are no longer partners in governance. They are stabilizers, symbolic anchors that prevent the structure from drifting into overt human ownership. And so the Anunnaki do not vanish. They fossilize. They become foundational layers, no longer visible on the surface, but still bearing weight. Civilization rests on them without ever touching them again. This is why there is no final story, no ending, no departure scene. Systems that end do so loudly. Systems that mature simply stop referencing their origins. The Anunnaki do not leave footprints in the later record because footprints imply movement. What disappears here is not movement, but relevance. The silence that remains is not empty. It is functional, and that is what makes it so difficult to dismiss, because a divine authority could be withdrawn without destabilizing the world. If governance could continue without its founders, then the most powerful act the gods ever performed may not have been creation. It may have been walking away. Once silence becomes normal, it stops being noticed. That is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Mesopotamian record. There is no moment where scribes pause and ask where the gods have gone. No lament preserved in clay. No crisis of faith documented in temple archives. The absence does not register as loss. It registers as continuity. And that tells us something crucial about how deeply the system had already shifted before anyone realized it had. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, divine authority has become something inherited rather than encountered. Kings do not wait for omens before ruling. Judges do not seek divine voices before sentencing. Administrators do not record divine instruction alongside economic decisions. They record outcomes: compliance, yield, failure, success. The gods remain named, but their names function like seals, stamps of legitimacy applied to processes that no longer require supervision. This is the final stage of delegation, not shared authority, not symbolic leadership, but structural irrelevance. The gods are still credited as founders, but founders do not run systems forever. Systems that require founders to remain present are fragile. Systems that can forget their founders are resilient. And this is where the Anunnaki cease to be actors and become architecture. Look closely at the later ritual texts. They are exhaustive, obsessive, every movement specified, every word prescribed, every offering measured. This level of detail is not the mark of a living conversation with the divine. It is the mark of a protocol. Ritual becomes maintenance rather than communication, a way of keeping the system aligned, not a way of seeking instruction. Divination follows the same pattern. Early traditions describe gods answering questions. Later traditions describe signs that must be interpreted. The difference is subtle but profound. An answer implies agency. A sign implies automation. The universe becomes readable because it has been programmed, not because it is responsive. Astrology embodies this shift perfectly. The stars do not speak. They move. Their movements can be predicted. Their meanings cataloged. Once enough data is collected, the system becomes self-referential. Priests no longer need revelation. They need training. Tables, calculations. Expertise replaces inspiration. And yet, belief does not weaken. It intensifies. The gods are everywhere in name, everywhere in symbol, everywhere in justification, but nowhere in dialogue. The system grows more religious as it grows less divine. This paradox only makes sense if belief is no longer about interaction, but about preservation. Ritual preserves memory. Law preserves authority. Kings preserve legitimacy. The gods are no longer expected to act. They are expected to remain unchanged, eternal, silent, perfectly still. Silence, in this context, is not failure. It is proof that the system is working. When later civilizations inherit Mesopotamian ideas, they inherit this model intact. Divine authority grants order once, then withdraws. The world runs on that grant indefinitely. Intervention becomes exceptional, then symbolic, then unthinkable. Even rebellion is framed not as rejection of the gods, but as violation of their established order. And that may be the most complete victory imaginable. Authority that no longer needs enforcement, power that persists without presence, control that operates through structure rather than command. If the Anunnaki ever ruled openly, then their greatest achievement was not domination. It was redundancy. Economies now move resources across regions and generations. Authority has layered itself so deeply into institutions that it no longer requires explanation. This is not decay. This is scale. And scale changes the nature of control. Early divine authority operated in a world small enough to be managed directly, a limited population, few cities, narrow administrative reach. In such a world, intervention is efficient. Correction is immediate. Presence matters. But as civilization expands, direct control becomes unstable. Too many variables, too many consequences, too many unintended outcomes. What once maintained order now threatens it. The Mesopotamian text preserves subtle traces of this realization. They do not announce it as philosophy. They do not frame it as reform. They record it through adjustment, through withdrawal, through the replacement of instruction with boundary. The gods stop telling humans what to do and instead define what humans cannot escape. Mortality, scarcity, consequence, time. This is where divine authority becomes systemic rather than managing outcomes. The gods establish constraints. Lifespan shorten. Fertility becomes uneven. Resources fluctuate. Disease appears. None of these are presented as punishment in later texts. They are treated as features of reality, as rules built into the structure of existence. The world becomes self-regulating, not because it is just, but because it is bounded. And once boundaries exist, oversight becomes redundant. This is the hidden logic behind the great withdrawal. Power does not vanish. It changes form. The Anunnaki stop acting because action is no longer the most effective way to rule. Systems outperform supervisors. Laws outperform commands. Structure outlasts presence. Human institutions mirror this transformation almost immediately. Kings no longer rule because they are strong or favored today. They rule because the system says they should. Dynasties replace individuals. Offices replace personalities. Authority becomes transferable, not personal. And once authority is transferable, it no longer requires the original source to remain involved. This is why later kings obsess over legitimacy rather than revelation. They do not seek new mandates from the gods. They prove continuity with old ones. Genealogies matter more than visions. Archives matter more than omens. Memory becomes power. And memory, unlike presence, does not interfere. The temples adapt seamlessly. They continue rituals not to solicit action, but to preserve alignment. Offerings become maintenance. Festivals become synchronization points between human time and cosmic time. Nothing is asked. Everything is repeated. Precision replaces passion. Correctness replaces devotion. This is not loss of faith. It is refinement. Divination evolves the same way. Earlier priests listened. Later priests calculated. The difference marks a shift from dialogue to decoding. Divine will becomes embedded in patterns that can be studied, archived, taught. Knowledge replaces encounter. Training replaces inspiration. The system becomes accessible, without the gods ever needing to speak again. This is when the Anunnaki fully transform from rulers into principles. They no longer need to appear, because their influence has become ambient, like gravity, like time, like law, invisible, unquestioned, unavoidable. The highest form of control is the one that feels like nature, and here lies the quiet danger. When authority disguises itself as structure, resistance becomes unthinkable. You cannot argue with gravity. You cannot negotiate with time. You cannot rebel against rules that feel inherent to reality itself. The Mesopotamian world does not mourn the gods because it no longer experiences them as separate beings. They have dissolved into the framework of existence. Their withdrawal is complete precisely because it is unnoticed, and this raises a final, deeply unsettling possibility as we move forward. Perhaps the Anunnaki did not leave because they were finished with humanity. Perhaps they left because humanity had become predictable, and a predictable system does not need rulers. It only needs boundaries. Once boundaries replace instruction, power no longer needs a face. This is the moment when human authority quietly expands into the space the gods no longer occupy, not by declaration, not by rebellion, but by habit, by repetition, by operating the system day after day until no one remembers what direct divine involvement was supposed to look like. Kings do not announce that they are replacing the gods. They would never dare. Instead, they rule as if the gods are watching, while knowing, through experience, that nothing interrupts them. This produces a peculiar form of confidence, not arrogance, but certainty. Decisions are made, wars are fought, laws are enforced, and the absence of divine correction becomes its own confirmation. The texts reveal this shift most clearly in how responsibility is framed. Early records treat disasters as divine reactions. Later records treat them as consequences. Crop failure is no longer a god's anger. It is mismanagement, weather, imbalance. Defeat in war is no longer divine abandonment. It is strategy, logistics, numbers. The gods remain the ultimate explanation, but they are no longer the immediate cause. This is a crucial psychological transition. When causes become human, solutions become human as well. Authority begins to justify itself through effectiveness rather than favor. A king who succeeds is assumed to be divinely supported. A king who fails is assumed to have violated the system, not because a god intervened, but because the rules were ignored. The silence trains humanity to take ownership without admitting it. Bureaucracy becomes the new sacred space. Archives replace oracles. Written precedent replaces divine judgment. Once something is written, it no longer needs to be reapproved. Clay tablets do not change their minds. This gives recorded authority a stability that living authority cannot match. And the Mesopotamians understood this instinctively. They copied texts obsessively. They preserved lists, codes, genealogies, omens, rituals. Not because they feared forgetting, but because forgetting would require reauthorization. Memory locks power in place. Over time, the gods themselves become part of the archive. Their names are preserved, their roles defined, their hierarchies fixed. But fixed hierarchies do not act. They remain, and remaining is enough. The divine council, once imagined as deliberated, evidence flows in one direction only. Outcome becomes proof. In this environment, innovation becomes risky. Change implies uncertainty, and uncertainty might invite attention. So systems harden. Rituals become rigid. Laws become fixed. The world becomes stable, but brittle. Yet for centuries, it works. Empires rise not because gods guide them, but because structures support them. Armies are supplied. Roads are built. Taxes collected. Records kept. Everything functions. And because it functions, no one questions the absence at the center. The Anunnaki have not vanished. They have been absorbed. Their authority diffused into procedure. Their presence dissolved into habit. Their power preserved not through action, but through normalization. And this is the point of no return. Once a system runs without its founders, it cannot acknowledge that fact without destabilizing itself. To admit the gods are no longer involved would be to admit that authority has shifted entirely into human hands. That realization would fracture legitimacy, so the silence is protected. It is never named, never discussed, never challenged. The gods are still said to rule, but only in ways that can never be tested. And that is the most enduring form of power imaginable. A system that functions without oversight eventually reveals a dangerous truth. Restraint was never embedded as deeply as authority. The god withdrew, but limits did not fully replace them. Rules exist, boundaries exist, procedures exist, yet none of these carry intention. They do not care. They do not judge motive. They only operate. And when humans inherit power inside such a system, the absence of intention becomes visible. Mesopotamian records begin to show this strain not through collapse, but through over-documentation. Laws grow longer. Penalties grow harsher. Procedures grow more specific. This is not moral progress. It is compensation. When authority is no longer actively present, control must be reinforced through detail. Every loophole must be sealed. Every contingency anticipated. Justice becomes mechanical because judgment no longer comes from above. The Code of Hammurabi is often praised as a triumph of early law, and in many ways it is. But read carefully, and it reveals anxiety rather than confidence. The laws do not assume fairness. They enforce it through threat. They do not rely on wisdom. They rely on consequence. Punishment is calibrated not to restore balance, but to deter deviation. This is governance without trust, a system that knows it cannot appeal upward, so it tightens inward. The gods appear only as distant endorsers. They do not weigh evidence. They do not interpret intent. They do not adjust outcomes. Once the code is set, it stands alone. The judge follows it. The citizen obeys it. The divine presence exists only as a warning against altering it. This is a world where law has replaced conscience. At first, this seems efficient, predictable, stable, but predictability invites exploitation. When rules are fixed and oversight is absent, power flows to those who understand the system best, not those who serve it most justly. Elites learn to navigate law rather than embody it. Authority becomes procedural rather than moral, and the texts begin to reflect this shift in subtle ways. Complaints appear, petitions, appeals, not to gods, but to kings. Humans now seek justice from humans, because divine justice has become abstract. The king becomes a final court of appeal, not because he is wiser, but because there is nowhere else to go. This marks a silent but complete transfer of responsibility. When disasters strike, explanations change. Floods are no longer framed as divine resets. They are engineering failures. Famine becomes a supply problem. Disease becomes fate rather than punishment. The language shifts from meaning to management. And management, unlike meaning, can always be optimized. Empires grow on this logic. Expansion becomes rational. Conquest becomes administrative. Cities are not destroyed. They are absorbed. Populations are relocated, taxed, counted. The system spreads not through revelation, but through replication. Yet beneath this efficiency lies a growing imbalance. Without divine intervention, there is no corrective force beyond human judgment. And human judgment, left unchecked, bends toward advantage. The gods once limited kings by reminding them they were servants. Now kings limit themselves, or not at all. This is why later texts become obsessed with order, cosmic order, social order, ritual order. Disorder becomes the ultimate fear because there is no higher authority to restore balance if it breaks. Chaos is no longer a divine problem. It is a human one. The silence that once felt stable begins to feel heavy. And yet, no one calls for the gods to return, because return would imply failure. It would mean the system humans inherited could not sustain itself, and admitting that would unravel everything. So the world presses forward. The Anunnaki remain invoked, honored, remembered, but never consulted. And authority continues to operate in their absence, increasingly confident, increasingly rigid, increasingly human. What emerges is not godlessness. It is autonomy without accountability. And as the system tightens, as power concentrates, as law replaces wisdom, the question that lingers beneath every tablet and inscription grows sharper. If the gods are no longer watching, who is stopping us? The warning does not arrive as prophecy. It arrives as repetition. The same problems appear again and again across centuries, across empires, across kings who never met in cities that never shared borders. Corruption, overreach, exploitation, concentration of wealth, abuse of authority. None of these are framed as sins against the gods. They are framed as disruptions of order, technical failures inside an otherwise functional system. This is how a civilization learns to fear instability more than injustice. As long as the system holds, suffering can be rationalized. As long as taxes are collected, armies paid, temples supplied, the machinery is considered successful. Moral failure becomes secondary to administrative success. And because the gods no longer intervene, nothing interrupts this logic. There is no divine correction to remind rulers that power has limits beyond law. The texts grow increasingly defensive. Kings inscribe long lists of achievements, victories, restorations. They emphasize how at the opening of laws, at the dedication of temples. They authorize, but they do not appear. Their presence is purely ceremonial. And ceremony, unlike action, cannot interfere. This creates a world where power flows freely upward, but responsibility does not flow back down. Kings claim divine mandate, but the gods no longer claim kings. There is no reciprocal obligation. The relationship has become one-sided. The silence hardens into doctrine. Later theologians describe the gods as having completed creation. The world is finished. Order is established. Nothing new is required. Human history unfolds within boundaries already set. This interpretation removes any expectation of further intervention. To wait for the gods is to misunderstand their role. The implication is chilling. If the gods have finished their work, then whatever happens next is humanity's responsibility alone, whether humanity realizes it or not. Yet even this realization is muted. It never becomes a philosophical declaration. It is simply lived, practiced, normalized. By the end of this phase, the Anunnaki are no longer rulers, nor even overseers. They are axioms, unquestioned assumptions embedded so deeply into civilization that they no longer need to be examined. And axioms, once accepted, shape everything built upon them. This is a turning point. The silence that once signaled maturity now begins to resemble abandonment, not because the gods have changed, but because the consequences of their absence have accumulated. Power has become self-justifying. Law has become self-referential. Authority answers only to itself. And still, no tablet records alarm, because systems do not recognize danger until they fail. They only record what continues, and what continues relentlessly is the silence. Eventually, even the most stable systems encounter pressure they were not designed to absorb, not because they are weak, but because they were built for continuity, not disruption. Mesopotamian civilization had perfected order. What it had not prepared for was loss. The first cracks do not appear in theology. They appear in geography. Trade routes fracture. Borders shift. Distant regions stop responding to centralized authority. Empires that once expanded effortlessly begin fighting simply to maintain their edges. And still, the gods do not intervene. In earlier ages, such moments would have demanded explanation. Ritual intensification. Public repentance. Appeals to divine judgment. But now, responses are practical. Defensive walls are reinforced. Armies are reorganized. Administrators tighten control. The system reacts inward, not upward. This is the test the silence was never meant to face. When Akkad falls, when UR collapses, when cities that once seemed eternal are abandoned to sand and ruin, the texts do not accuse the gods of failure. They accuse people. Weak kings, corrupt officials, neglected rituals, poor planning. Human error absorbs every consequence. The divine order remains untouched, precisely because it no longer acts. Invasion after invasion follows this pattern. Foreign powers arrive not as cosmic disruptors, but as logistical forces. They seize granaries, redirect labor, claim titles. They adopt local gods, perform local rituals, invoke the same divine names. The system survives conquest because conquest does not challenge its foundations. Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, each inherits the structure. Each claims legitimacy through the same silent authority. The Anunnaki are invoked, but never expected to resist. This is when something subtle but irreversible occurs. Divine authority no longer protects the land it once governed. Cities fall despite perfect ritual compliance. Temples burn despite flawless offerings. Kings are defeated despite impeccable lineage. And still no response. The silence, once a sign of control, now becomes indistinguishable from indifference. Later texts begin to hint at discomfort, though never directly. Laments appear, not accusing the gods, but mourning the cities, weeping over ruined temples, over abandoned streets. The language is emotional, but careful. Sorrow is permitted. Blame is not. The gods are said to have turned their faces away, not departed, not defeated, simply looking elsewhere. This phrasing matters. It preserves divine perfection while acknowledging absence. It allows suffering without contradiction. The gods remain sovereign. They are simply no longer engaged. And this is a final psychological adaptation. If the gods have turned away, then survival no longer depends on pleasing them. It depends on endurance, on memory, on rebuilding, on carrying the system forward, even when it no longer delivers protection. Civilization becomes self-rescuing. The temples are rebuilt not because gods demand it, but because people need continuity. Ritual becomes identity rather than expectation. Law becomes stability rather than justice. Kingship becomes administration rather than sacred office. The Anunnaki are still named, but now they belong to the past more than the present. And for the first time, the silence feels heavy. Not because the gods are gone, but because no one believes their return would change anything. This is the moment where divine absence stops being philosophical and starts being historical, where silence is no longer a design choice, but a condition of the world. And yet, the system holds, which raises the most difficult question of all. If civilization can survive invasion, collapse, loss, and suffering without divine intervention, what role do the gods ever truly play? Not creators, not saviors, but architects. And architects do not stay to live in what they build. They leave, trusting the structure to stand on its own. Whether that trust is justified is what the rest of history will answer. The moment the earlier assumptions begin to collapse, a far more unsettling question quietly takes their place. If these records were not mistakes, and if these inconsistencies were not the result of poor documentation, then the only remaining explanation is one that historians have long tried to avoid, that the maps were showing something real, something deliberately preserved, and something meant to be understood only by those who already knew where to look. At this stage, the story stops being about geography and begins to revolve around intent, because errors repeat by accident, but patterns repeat by design. Across different centuries, cultures, and languages, a strange consistency emerges. Coastline. As researchers began revisiting these maps with contemporary tools, a new layer of the mystery revealed itself. When the ancient coastlines were digitally overlaid onto modern geographical models, the match was not approximate. It was precise. In some cases, the alignment was closer than maps produced just a few centuries ago, after the invention of modern navigation instruments. This raised a deeply uncomfortable possibility that whoever originally created the source material possessed knowledge that modern civilization would not officially develop until much later. At this point, the story forces us to reconsider one of the most basic assumptions about history, that technological progress moves in a straight line. The idea that ancient civilizations were primitive compared to the modern world is deeply ingrained. Yet these maps quietly contradict that belief. They suggest that advanced understanding may have existed before, been lost, and then rediscovered. And if that is true, then history is not a story of constant advancement, but of cycles, knowledge rising, disappearing, and returning in fragments. The question then becomes unavoidable. If such knowledge once existed, who held it? And more importantly, why does it only survive in scattered pieces, hidden inside documents that appear incomplete, damaged, or misunderstood? Some scholars argue that this information was never meant to be widespread, that it was restricted to a small group, navigators, astronomers, or elite scholars, whose role was not to explain the world to everyone, but to preserve critical information through collapse, war, and cultural resets. There is a noticeable pattern in where these maps were kept and how they were treated. Many were discovered in private collections, monastery archives, or royal libraries, often misfiled or mislabeled. Some were found folded inside unrelated manuscripts, as if deliberately hidden in plain sight. Others show signs of having been copied repeatedly, with later scribes preserving the shapes but clearly not understanding their significance. This suggests transmission without comprehension, knowledge passed down mechanically after its original context had already vanished. As this realization sinks in, another unsettling detail comes into focus. Several of these maps depict features that would have been impossible to observe without a vantage point far above the Earth's surface. Large-scale ice formations, submerged coastlines, and continental outlines appear as though viewed from the sky. For a long time, this observation was dismissed as speculative, but with modern imaging, the resemblance has become increasingly difficult to deny. The perspective embedded in these maps does not align with ground-level exploration. This is where the narrative takes a sharp turn. Because once the idea of an elevated viewpoint is introduced, the mystery expands beyond simple navigation. It touches on questions of lost surveying methods, unknown observational technologies, or even conceptual frameworks that no longer exist. The maps begin to feel less like product of trial and error exploration, and more like outputs derived from a system, one that could measure, calculate, and visualize the Earth as a whole. Naturally, such implications are uncomfortable. They challenge the established timeline of human capability. And when timelines are challenged, institutions tend to resist. This resistance is subtle, rarely overt. Instead of direct denial, there is silence. Funding is redirected. Research shifts focus. Discussions are labeled as speculative and quietly removed from serious academic circles. Over time, the subject becomes niche, then fringe, and eventually forgotten by the mainstream. Yet outside official institutions, independent researchers continue to ask questions others avoid. They notice that the same regions appear repeatedly across unrelated maps. Certain coastlines receive disproportionate attention. Certain landforms are emphasized again and again, as if they held special importance. These repetitions suggest that the maps were not merely descriptive, but selective. They were pointing towards something specific, something that mattered enough to preserve across generations. And this is where the deeper implication begins to surface. If these maps were selective, then they were not simply recording the world as it was. They were highlighting locations of significance, places of resources, strategic importance, or perhaps something even more abstract, the possibility that these maps encoded priorities, not just geography, transforms how they must be interpreted. They stop being neutral documents and start resembling tools. At this stage, the viewer is left with a difficult realization. The mystery is no longer about whether ancient maps are accurate. That question has already been answered. The real mystery is why this accuracy exists, why it was preserved in such an incomplete and fragmented form, and why modern history struggles to acknowledge it. Because once this door is opened, it does not simply change how we view maps. It changes how we understand the past itself. And just as this realization settles in, another layer of evidence begins to emerge. One that suggests these maps may not have been isolated creations at all, but part of a much larger system, deliberately designed to survive the erosion of time. What becomes clear is that these maps do not behave like independent creations. When examined collectively, they begin to resemble fragments of a unified framework, pieces of a system that was never meant to survive intact. Instead of telling a complete story on their own, each map seems to assume the existence of others, as if the viewer was expected to already understand the larger structure they belong to. This realization reframes everything. The gaps are no longer accidents. They are features. In several cases, researchers have noticed that when one map appears vague or distorted in a certain region, another map from a different culture compensates with striking clarity in the same area. It is as though the information was distributed intentionally, broken apart, and scattered across civilizations that were never supposed to reconnect. This method of preservation would make the knowledge nearly impossible to erase completely, while also ensuring that no single society could fully control or misuse it. Knowledge, in this sense, becomes resilient by being incomplete. This strategy only makes sense if the original creators understood something fundamental about the nature of collapse. Civilizations fall, libraries burn, languages die, but fragments endure. A coastline copied incorrectly is still recognizable centuries later. A proportion preserved without explanation can still be measured. The maps appear to have been designed not for clarity, but for survivability. They were meant to last, not to be understood immediately. As modern analysts began mapping these fragments against each other, a strange hierarchy emerged. Certain regions appear central, referenced repeatedly, while others remain vague or absent. These focal areas are not random. They align with yet many of these maps ignore obvious maritime dangers, while emphasizing inland features with no apparent navigational value. Mountain ranges are exaggerated. Plateaus are isolated. River systems are drawn with mathematical precision, even when they offer no practical benefit to travel. These choices suggest priorities beyond movement. They suggest assessment. Some researchers propose that the maps function more like surveys and charts. Not surveys in a modern sense, but evaluations, records of terrain stability, resource distribution, and environmental patterns over long periods of time. This interpretation explains why certain submerged coastlines appear with such clarity. They were not being drawn as they were, but as they had been, or perhaps as they were expected to become again. Time, in these maps, feels strangely flexible. This leads to one of the most controversial observations. Several ancient maps appear to depict landscapes that only make sense under drastically different climate conditions. Ice-free polar regions, exposed continental shelves, altered river paths that do not match any known historical period, but do align with geological models of deep prehistory. If these interpretations are correct, then the maps are not merely ancient. They are remembering something humanity is not supposed to remember. Naturally, this suggestion is met with skepticism. Mainstream history relies on physical artifacts, datable materials, and linear timelines. A map that implies knowledge of landscapes tens of thousands of years old disrupts that structure entirely. And yet, the data does not disappear simply because it is inconvenient. The shapes remain. The proportions persist. The alignments continue to match reality with unsettling accuracy. As this tension grows, so does the silence around the subject. Conferences avoid it. Journals reject it as speculative. The conversation retreats into specialized circles where it is discussed cautiously, often framed as theoretical rather than evidential. But outside these boundaries, a quiet reevaluation is taking place. Independent teams are reanalyzing the maps using tools unavailable to earlier scholars: satellite imaging, geospatial modeling, and climate reconstruction software. The results, while rarely publicized, consistently point in the same direction. One particularly revealing pattern emerges when elevation data is considered. Certain maps emphasize terrain that would have been invisible before modern topographic methods. Subtle changes in slope, base, and depth and plateau structure appear encoded in ways that suggest an understanding of vertical geography, not just surface layout. This level of detail implies systematic measurement, and measurement implies method. The absence of any clear explanation for such methods is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all. No written records describe them. No tools have been definitively identified. No surviving tradition claims ownership of this knowledge. It exists only in the output, not in the process. This inversion, results without instructions, forces a radical reconsideration of how knowledge can persist independently of culture. At this stage, the maps no longer feel like artifacts left behind accidentally. They feel intentional, like messages sent forward through time without a sender's name. Their creators may have understood that explanations would not survive, but that geometry might, that numbers could outlast stories, that shapes could endure where languages fail. In this sense, the maps are less about where humanity has been and more about what humanity once understood. And this realization brings a narrative to a critical threshold. Because if these maps represent inherited knowledge rather than discovered knowledge, then modern civilization may not be the first to comprehend the planet at a global scale. It may simply be the most recent. The implications of this idea extend far beyond cartography. They touch archaeology, geology, and the very definition of progress. As the evidence continues to accumulate, one final question begins to dominate the discussion. If this knowledge once existed and was deliberately fragmented, what event or series of events made such extreme preservation necessary? What were the original creators trying to protect this information from? Or perhaps more unsettling still, who were they trying to protect it for? And just as this question settles into the viewer's mind, the focus shifts away from the maps themselves and toward the world they describe, a world that may not belong solely to the past, but one whose patterns are beginning to reappear in the present. That shift, from ancient documents to modern reality, is where the narrative becomes impossible to ignore. Because once the patterns described by the maps are compared with present-day data, a disturbing continuity emerges. The regions emphasized centuries ago are not dormant relics of the past. They are active, they are changing, and in some cases, they are becoming increasingly unstable in ways that mirror the very features the maps seem so intent on preserving. Modern geological monitoring reveals that many of these highlighted regions sit atop fault lines, volcanic systems, or zones of unusual tectonic behavior. Others coincide with areas experiencing rapid climate-driven transformation, melting ice sheets, rising sea levels, shifting river basins. This alignment suggests that the maps were not simply recording static geography, but dynamic processes, landscapes in motion, landscapes that change, disappear, and re-emerge over time. This realization reframes the maps yet again. They may not have been designed to guide travelers across space, but to guide future observers across time. Instead of asking where to go, they may have been asking when to look. Certain coastlines only make sense during lower sea levels. Certain land bridges appear only during glacial periods. Certain inland features become visible only after erosion strips away surface layers. The maps appear to anticipate these transitions, as though their creators understood the Earth as a living system rather than a fixed stage. What makes this particularly unsettling is that the systems-level thinking aligns closely with modern Earth sciences, disciplines that only emerged in the last century. Plate tectonics, climate cycles, and long-term geological feedback loops are concepts we now take for granted. Yet the maps seem to reflect an intuitive grasp of these ideas long before the language to describe them existed. Knowledge without terminology, insight without theory. At this point, skepticism often shifts direction. Instead of denying the accuracy of the maps, critics question interpretation. They argue that modern analysts may be projecting contemporary understanding onto ancient artifacts. That pattern recognition can create meaning where none was intended. And while this caution is valid, it fails to explain one crucial detail. The maps consistently anticipate discoveries that were unknown at the time of their modern analysis. In most framework was thinking far beyond a single generation, or even a single era. As attention shifts toward this possibility, another question quietly emerges. Why does this knowledge resurface now? Why are these patterns becoming visible at a time when global systems, climate, infrastructure, ecosystems are under increasing strain? The coincidence is difficult to ignore. The same forces that would make ancient geographic knowledge relevant again are the forces reshaping the modern world. Some researchers speculate that these maps function as warning systems rather than records, that they highlight regions prone to cyclical disruption, flooding, seismic activity, or environmental collapse. If true, then the selective emphasis makes sense. These were the areas future societies would need to understand, rebuild around, or avoid entirely. The maps may not have been about control, but about continuity. This interpretation casts the original creators in a different light. Instead of conquerors or explorers, they appear as observers, caretakers of knowledge who understood that collapse was inevitable, but total loss was not. Their goal may not have been to preserve power, but to preserve awareness, to leave behind enough information that a future civilization, facing similar challenges, might recognize the patterns before it was too late. Yet this brings us to a more uncomfortable implication. If such a civilization existed, capable of observing Earth at a global scale and thinking in deep time, then its disappearance becomes a central mystery. Advanced understanding does not vanish quietly. Something must have interrupted it. Whether that interruption was environmental, internal, or external remains unknown. But the silence left behind is telling. There are no monuments celebrating this knowledge. No myths clearly describing its methods. Only fragments, maps without manuals, data without context. This absence suggests that whatever ended that era did so abruptly enough to prevent transmission, but not so completely as to erase all traces. The maps, in this sense, are survivors. They outlive their makers. As this possibility settles in, the narrative reaches another turning point. The mystery is no longer confined to the distant past. It begins to reflect forward. If knowledge can be lost once, it can be lost again. And if the maps represent a previous attempt to understand and adapt to planetary change, then their relevance today becomes deeply personal. They are no longer historical artifacts. They are mirrors. The viewer is left with an uneasy awareness. Modern civilization prides itself on progress, yet it is facing challenges that echo those hinted at in these ancient documents. Rising seas, shifting climates, fragile systems stretch beyond their limits. The same Earth, the same cycles, repeating once more. And suddenly, the question is no longer what the maps mean, but whether we are prepared to understand them in time. Because perhaps the most unsettling possibility of all is this. The maps were never meant to be mysterious. They were meant to be obvious to those who reached a certain level of understanding. And if they feel confusing now, it may not be because they are wrong, but because we are only just beginning to see what their creators assumed would eventually be known. And as this realization takes hold, the story moves toward its most profound implication. That history may not be a straight ascent from ignorance to knowledge, but a fragile loop, one that humanity has already completed once before and may be approaching again. The transition into the final phase of the story does not arrive with revelation, but with a realization. By this point, the maps are no longer the central mystery. They have already done their work. What matters now is what they imply about humanity's relationship with knowledge, memory, and survival. Because once the possibility of forgotten global understanding is accepted, it forces a reevaluation not just of the past, but of the assumptions shaping the present. One of the most striking aspects of this entire puzzle is how familiar it begins to feel. The challenges implied by the maps, environmental instability, shifting coastlines, fragile systems, are no longer abstract. They are headlines. They are measurements. They are projections. The same planetary forces that appear encoded in ancient documents are now being modeled by supercomputers and debated in policy rooms. The difference is not the problem itself, but how prepared society is to respond to it. This is where the deeper warning may reside. If an earlier civilization reached a level of understanding sufficient to observe Earth as a system, then failed to endure, the lesson is not technological. It is structural. Knowledge alone does not guarantee survival. Awareness does not automatically translate into resilience. Something else is required: coordination, restraint, long-term thinking. Qualities that civilizations historically struggle to maintain under pressure. Modern society often assumes that access to information is the ultimate safeguard. Yet the maps challenge this belief. They suggest that information can persist while wisdom disappears. That data can be preserved even when the framework needed to act on it collapses. This distinction is subtle but critical. The ancient knowledge implied by the maps may not have been lost because it was wrong, but because it was no longer usable within the social systems that inherited it. There is also an uncomfortable parallel in how these maps were treated and how modern warnings are often handled. Early anomalies are dismissed. Outliers are ignored. Conversations are postponed in favor of short-term stability. By the time patterns are undeniable, the window for easy solutions has often closed. The past, in this sense, does not repeat itself dramatically. It repeats itself quietly. As researchers continue to examine these documents, a consensus slowly forms around one idea. The maps were not meant to inspire awe. They were meant to be practical. They were not stories, myths, or symbols. They were tools designed to endure beyond the lifespan of any single culture. Their creators may have understood that civilizations are temporary, but the planet is not. Any attempt to plan for the future, therefore, had to be planetary in scope. This raises a final, deeply human question. If we are now capable of understanding what these maps were pointing toward, are we capable of acting differently than those who came before us? Or are we destined to repeat the same cycle, accumulating insight while remaining structurally unprepared to use it? The maps do not answer this question. They only frame it. Perhaps that is their true purpose, not to provide solutions, but to force recognition, to make future observers confront the reality that advanced knowledge can coexist with collapse, that progress is not permanent, that civilization is not guaranteed. In this light, the maps feel less like remnants of a lost world and more like messages left for a future audience that had not yet arrived. The unsettling, it was because understanding alone was not enough. And that may be the most important insight hidden in plain sight, not in the coastlines or the proportions or the anomalies, but in the silence that followed them. The map survived. Their civilization did not. And as the final implication settles in, the story stops being about ancient mysteries and becomes something far more immediate, a question directed not at the past, but at the present. Whether this time, with all our tools and all our knowledge, the outcome will be any different, or whether future generations will one day study our remnants the same way we now study these maps, wondering how so much understanding could have led to another forgotten world. That unanswered question lingers because it refuses to stay theoretical. Once the story reaches this point, it becomes clear that the maps are not warning us about a single catastrophe or a specific event. They are pointing toward a pattern of behavior, a pattern in which civilizations become increasingly capable of understanding the world, yet increasingly disconnected from the long-term consequences of their actions. This disconnect, more than any external threat, may be what ends them. One of the most revealing lessons hidden within the maps is how little emphasis they place on political boundaries, cultural divisions, or centers of power. Empires rise and fall, names change, borders shift, yet the maps remain indifferent to all of it. Rivers flow regardless of who claims them. Fault lines move regardless of treaties. Coastlines retreat without regard for human timelines. The planet, as depicted in these documents, does not recognize civilization as permanent. This planetary indifference is deeply uncomfortable. Modern societies often assume that scale equals control, that global reach, advanced technology, and economic complexity provide insulation from collapse. But the maps suggest the opposite. The more complex a system becomes, the more vulnerable it is to disruption when underlying environmental conditions shift. Fragility, not strength, becomes a defining feature of advanced civilizations. There is evidence that the creators of these maps understood this fragility. Their focus on long-term geographic processes implies an awareness that surface stability can be deceptive. A coastline can appear unchanged for centuries, then transform within a single generation. A climate can remain predictable until feedback loops push it past a threshold. These are not sudden events in geological terms, but they are sudden in human terms. This perspective helps explain why the maps feel emotionally distant. They do not dramatize collapse. They do not mark disasters. They simply record conditions and trends. In doing so, they force the observer to confront a difficult truth. Collapse rarely looks like an ending from the inside. It feels like normality continuing right up until it doesn't. Modern parallels are hard to ignore. Infrastructure built for stable conditions is now exposed to variability it was never designed to withstand. Agricultural systems optimized for predictability face increasing uncertainty. Coastal populations expand even as the land beneath them becomes less reliable. These choices are not irrational. They are logical responses to short-term incentives. And that is precisely the problem the maps seem to be highlighting. The deeper message may be that intelligence and foresight are not the same thing. A civilization can be extraordinarily intelligent, capable of modeling climate systems, mapping tectonic plates, and tracking planetary changes, while still lacking the foresight to reorganize itself accordingly. Knowledge accumulates faster than adaptation. The maps, in this sense, are not about what was known, but about what was done with that knowledge. Another unsettling aspect emerges when considering how selectively these documents survived. They were not preserved by accident. They endured because they were copied, hidden, and protected, often by institutions that no longer understood their original purpose. This suggests that even as civilizations lose coherence, they instinctively protect fragments of meaning, hoping that someone, someday, will know what to do with them. This instinct is deeply human. It is the same impulse behind time capsules, archives, and data vaults. But the maps hint at a painful irony. Preserving information does not guarantee that it will be interpreted correctly or acted upon in time. Without context, even the most accurate data can become inert. It can be admired, studied, and ultimately ignored. As the narrative reaches its final stretch, the focus subtly shifts from ancient creators to modern observers. The responsibility moves forward. The question becomes whether recognizing these patterns is enough to break them, or whether recognition itself is simply another stage in the cycle, a moment of clarity that arrives too late to change the outcome. The maps do not offer reassurance. They do not suggest that collapse is inevitable, but neither do they promise escape. What they provide is perspective, a reminder that civilization is an experiment, not a guarantee, that progress must be actively maintained, not assumed, and that the planet operates on timescales that dwarf human ambition. In the end, the most haunting aspect of these maps is not what they reveal about the past, but what they imply about choice. If a previous civilization reached a similar threshold of understanding and still failed, then the deciding factor was never knowledge. It was will. Whether the will to act, to change, and to think beyond immediate advantage exists today remains an open question, one that cannot be answered by studying ancient documents alone. It can only be answered by what happens next. As the story approaches its conclusion, the emphasis quietly but unmistakably turns inward. By now, the ancient maps have fulfilled their role as evidence. What remains is interpretation and responsibility. Because once patterns are recognized, ignoring them becomes a choice. The past no longer feels distant or abstract. It becomes a mirror held up to the present, reflecting uncomfortable similarities that are difficult to dismiss. One of the most profound insights suggested by these documents is that collapse is rarely the result of a single failure. It is the accumulation of many small decisions, each rational in isolation, each postponing discomfort to preserve stability. Over time, these decisions align into a trajectory that becomes increasingly difficult to reverse. The maps, with their long-term perspective, seem designed to counter this short-term thinking. They operate on scales that force the observer to confront consequences far beyond a single lifetime. This may explain why the knowledge encoded within them feels emotionally detached. The maps do not appeal to fear or urgency. They do not persuade. They simply present reality in its most unvarnished form. In doing so, they demand a level of maturity from those who encounter them, a willingness to act without the pressure of immediate crisis. Historically, this has been one of humanity's greatest challenges. They highlight what will happen if nothing changes, not what must be done. Another striking parallel lies in how warnings are framed. Catastrophic predictions often fail to motivate meaningful change because they feel distant or abstract. Gradual trends, on the other hand, are easier to ignore precisely because they unfold slowly. The maps seem to bypass both approaches. Instead of forecasting disaster, they document conditions. They leave the interpretation and the burden of response to the observer. At this stage, it becomes clear that the maps are not instructive in the conventional sense. They do not provide guidance, solutions, or strategies. They provide context. They expand the temporal horizon within which decisions must be evaluated. In doing so, they challenge a deeply ingrained assumption that the future will resemble the present closely enough for existing systems to adapt naturally. This assumption may be the most dangerous of all. History suggests that stability often precedes disruption, not because change was invisible, but because it was inconvenient. The creators of these maps may have understood that the hardest truths are not those that shock, but those that ask for sustained restraint and coordination over generations. As this realization takes hold, the role of the viewer subtly changes. No longer a passive observer of an ancient mystery, the audience becomes part of the narrative. The same question that likely confronted the mapmakers now confronts us. What do you do when you understand trajectory, but not the timing? When you can see the pattern, but cannot predict the exact moment it will assert itself? The temptation, historically, has been to delay, to trust that future innovations will resolve emerging constraints, to assume that adaptation will occur organically without the need for deliberate intervention. The maps suggest that this assumption has failed before. They do not accuse. They simply record the aftermath. In this sense, the second-to-last implication of the maps is not despair, but accountability. They strip away the comfort of ignorance. They remove the excuse of not knowing. What remains is a stark choice: to treat knowledge as a tool for transformation or as a form of intellectual insulation that allows familiar behaviors to continue unchanged. The maps survive because they were designed to outlast denial. The question now is whether understanding them will outlast convenience. The final realization arrives without spectacle. There is no hidden chamber, no lost city emerging from the ground, no single revelation that resolves every question. Instead, the documentary closes on something far more unsettling: clarity. The kind that does not excite, but lingers. The kind that reframes everything that came before. By the end, the ancient maps no longer feel ancient at all. They feel familiar. Their logic mirrors the way modern science now views the planet, as an interconnected system, sensitive to thresholds, shaped by cycles, and indifferent to human ambition. What once seemed impossible for early civilizations to understand now feels uncomfortably aligned with what we are only beginning to accept ourselves. This convergence is not coincidence. It suggests that advanced understanding is not unique to any one era. It emerges when societies are forced to observe reality closely enough to survive. The tragedy implied by the maps is not that such understanding existed, but that it was not enough. Knowledge, when isolated from collective action, becomes historical evidence rather than a living force. The silence surrounding the disappearance of the mapmakers speaks louder than any surviving text. There are no final warnings etched into stone, no legends celebrating their foresight. Only documents that endure because they were practical, durable, and abstract enough to survive misunderstanding. They were not meant to inspire belief. They were meant to preserve perspective. As the documentary draws to a close, the viewer is left with an uncomfortable truth. We often imagine the past as naive and the future as advanced. The map suggests a different reality, that humanity moves in cycles of awareness and amnesia. Each time knowledge reaches a certain depth, it faces a test, not of intelligence, but restraint, cooperation, and long-term vision. Whether our era will pass that test remains unknown. For the first time, however, the outcome is not obscured by ignorance. We can see the patterns. We can measure the risks. We can trace the same forces that shaped the past as they gather strength in the present. The advantage we possess is not superior intelligence, but timing. The maps did not fail their creators. They outlived them, and in doing so, they completed their purpose. They delivered understanding across a gap no civilization was guaranteed to cross. What happens next was never something they could encode. The final question, then, is not what these ancient documents mean. It is what we mean by progress, whether it is measured by how much we know, or by how carefully we act on what we know, whether the next fragments left behind will be warnings or evidence. The documentary ends not with an answer, but with a responsibility. Because if future generations ever study the remnants of our world, they will not ask what we believed. They will ask what we understood. And what we chose to do once understanding was no longer the problem. And in that question, the story truly ends.